It is so good to be here with you this morning. If you've heard me speak before, you know that I typically like to end my sermon with a very clear, practical, and personal application. Today's sermon didn't behave by those rules, and it doesn't really end with a clear, personal, and practical application. However, I want you to know if you're looking for that, it is sprinkled throughout this sermon, and I am trusting that you'll be able to follow this kind of new form for this one, because there's something I really wanted to end on that I thought would be really good that you could consider and reflect on throughout this weekend. So, with that in mind, I'd like for us to go back to the beginning of Scripture, all the way back to the beginning of time, and specifically what we read about in the poem that is Genesis chapter 1. Now, this is a metaphor for the idea of creation and the human origin story, and in this metaphor, the author talks about how God created creation in a progressive manner. In other words, it started small and continued to grow and evolve and change, and eventually it grew into something greater. And over 6 days, this poem goes, these different creations took on all sorts of material elements and became what we know as material creation. And after 6 days, after God has created everything and affirmed that all that is here is good, we read these words, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all their array were completed, and on the seventh day, God had finished all the work of creation, and so on the seventh day, God rested." God blessed the seventh day and called it sacred because on it, God rested from all the work of creation. So after God spends all of God's effort creating this life and this world, God says, but there's something else that needs to be added to this canvas, and that is a blank space. Now, this is particularly important in America today because what do we know is valuable in America today? Productivity. And in American culture today, we are hyper-focused on productivity, right? You all go to jobs or you go to school, and you learn about how productive you've been or how productive you are not being, and that is tied directly to your value. We hear over and over again, which is why the practice of Sabbath is more necessary than ever. This is a spiritual practice that reminds us that our value does not come from how much we produce, but instead comes directly from our humanity. The fact that we have a heartbeat is reminding us that we have immense value in God's eyes because we are human. I like to think of Sabbath this way. Let's imagine that you love this planet and you hear that God's saying that this planet is good, so you say, I want to take care of this planet. And you realize that the temperatures are rising, so you say, we have to do something as a human society. So you start to protest and you start to do your best to become a climate activist. You get involved with organizations, you get bills passed through Congress. You see meaningful change in your life and you spend years and years and years and decades making sure that the planet is taken care of. Until you get to the end of your life and you're looking back at your life and you're looking at all the things that you've done and you think to yourself, we got a lot done, but I kind of wish I would have spent more time in nature. So imagine spending your entire life working so hard to protect the planet that you forget to take time to enjoy the planet while you are still alive. This, for me, is what the Sabbath is. The day where you say, you know what, even though there is still work to do, you stop and you say, what is it that I am working toward? How can I enjoy that now? Because this life only allows me a few opportunities to fully enjoy it. So that is what the practice of Sabbath is, and it's directly tied to creation according to Genesis 1. And that came into play a few years later, around the year 1700 BCE, in the nation empire of Egypt, when the Egyptians had enslaved the Israelites. Now, they say that in Exodus, we read that they had been enslaved for 10 generations, which is the equivalent of 400 years. And the people that were enslaved, the Israelites, cried out and asked God for liberation, and God liberated them with a mighty hand into a free place. They eventually got out to the wilderness, and God brought them to Mount Sinai as a free nation for the first time. Now, at the base of Mount Sinai, the entire nation of Israel, newly liberated, sat while they looked up, and there was a cloud that covered this mountain, Mount Sinai, and Moses, their leader, would go up and talk with God about the new rules that were going to be established with this new nation. And the first rules that Moses got from God, according to the story, are the 10 Commandments. Now, the fourth commandment goes back to that creation story. We read these words, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath for Yahweh. Do no work on that day, neither you nor your daughter nor your son, nor your workers, women or men, nor your animals, nor the foreigner who lives among you. For in the 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that they hold, but rested on the seventh day. This is why Yahweh has blessed the Sabbath day and made it sacred." Now, I will tell you that I grew up in a Christian tradition that practiced and observed Sabbath. And while this sounds good on paper, to take one day off a week where you make sure you're not working, if you've practiced the Sabbath for yourself, then you know what qualifies as work and what qualifies as rest is a dominant question in your life, right? Because even though we don't get paid for it, we would call housework literal work, right? And the idea that you should do housework on the Sabbath day is completely against the rules, even though we don't get paid for it. What about this? What if you enjoy running, right? What if you're one of those people, right? You enjoy running, and you have a job where you stay at a desk for most of the job, so the way that you stay active and fit is you go running, but then you start running marathons, and one of those marathons falls on a Sabbath day. Should you run that marathon? You could say, well, I'm not working, but are you resting? No, right? This is the opposite of rest. Is that allowed even though you're not working? And you can see how if you try to keep this communally, it can be very difficult very quickly. What about when emergencies happen? Like, for instance, should firefighters keep Sabbath? It would be nice if fires kept Sabbath, but firefighters can't say, oh, I'm observing the Sabbath. I will not allow myself to help you in your hour of need. And so a lot of these questions started to filter in to the ancient Israelites as they started to figure out what Sabbath meant. And they came up with the idea that if it's an emergency, you need to break Sabbath to help somebody. That's what God would want, whether it's issues of fire or health care. And there was this gray areas, particularly around the military. Should you fight people if they attack you on the Sabbath? What about initiating wars on Sabbath? Was that okay? And there's no real definitive answer in all of the Hebrew Bible, particularly for the military. And so the question is, what qualifies as work and what qualifies as rest? These are difficult questions to answer as a society. It can be easy to personally answer it, but as a society, that's really difficult, right? And just when you think, okay, the Sabbath thing sounds interesting, a few chapters later, not many people know about this verse, but in Exodus, God then wants to up the ante according to the author of this book. And God says to Moses, make sure you keep the Sabbath for it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it must be put to death. Which, if you break the Sabbath, apparently now invokes the death penalty. Now, Leviticus talks a lot about what's appropriate during Sabbath and what's not. There's several verses about it. But then in the next book over, Numbers, which is still taking place during the life of Moses, there's another story that takes place on the Sabbath where they're out in the wilderness, the Israelites are, and they come across a man who is picking up firewood on the Sabbath. And this man is caught breaking the Sabbath, doing clear work, bringing these firewood in. And so they bring this man before Moses, and they say he was breaking the Sabbath, he was collecting firewood. And Moses isn't sure what to do, so in the story, Moses goes before God and asks God for guidance, and God says to Moses, you need to execute this man. And Moses executes him. Now, if that seems problematic, I want you to know you're not alone. I find it problematic. And not only that, but in the very next couple of verses, there is a rebellion that rises up because there's this concern that Moses has too much authority, as you could imagine, right? Who is he that gets to say, well, God said this, so you all have to listen to me? Now, the rebellion is quashed in the story in the book of Numbers, but it's important to acknowledge that there were people who saw all of this and said, I've got a problem with this. This seems too aggressive. I'm not sure that's who God is. And if you feel that way, you're part of that story in the book of Numbers. Now, this goes to the end of Moses' life when he is standing on the doorstep about to enter the promised land with this newly liberated nation. He's still leading the Israelites. They haven't made it there yet. And he is old, and he is about to give a sermon that basically says, I'm about to die. Here's what I want you to remember. That sermon became the book of Deuteronomy. And he stands on a hillside in the wilderness, and he gives the Israelites his parting wisdom. And in there, he recites the 10 Commandments once again when he says, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy as Yahweh your God commanded. He then goes on to say, remember, you were slaves in Egypt. You thought your value was tied to your productivity. You heard it from your slave owners over and over again. Do not forget to keep this Sabbath. And then Moses passes away. Now, after the book of Deuteronomy, what's really interesting is there's not a whole lot of stories or thoughts written about the Sabbath for the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Now, it's mentioned here and there, but it never takes up more than 2 chapters in a row. There is one story where the Sabbath plays a small part in it. It takes place about 500 years after the life of Moses. It's when the only queen of Judah ruled on the throne. Many people viewed her as illegitimate because she wasn't related to David. Her name was Athaliah, and she was on the throne. And it's a very confusing paragraph that takes place in 2 Kings. In this confusing paragraph, there are some people who work on the Sabbath and who don't, that are soldiers, and they're trying to figure out when the shift changes, and eventually when that shift changes, a man named Jehoiada leads a revolution and they overthrow Athaliah. It's really hard to pick apart the details, but that's in 2 Kings chapter 11. That's the first story that takes place after the life of Moses revolving around Sabbath. Then about 100 years after Athaliah in Jerusalem, there is a prophet named Isaiah, one of Israel's most famous prophets, one of Judah's most famous prophets, And he talks about how God is very upset with the people of Jerusalem, particularly in the way that God sees them honoring the Sabbath. He writes these words, don't bring any more of your useless offerings to me. Their incense fills me with loathing. New moons, Sabbaths, assemblies. I cannot endure another festival of injustice. And Isaiah goes on to talk about how the poor are starving while the religious institution is having all of their fancy feasts for religious festivals, and how angry this makes God. About 100 years after Isaiah, we come across another prophet named Jeremiah who is convinced that God wants the people of Jerusalem to stop exchanging commerce on Sabbath. In fact, there's one chapter where he talks about this. It is chapter 17, where Jeremiah is convinced that God is telling him that people should not bring international goods through a gate on Sabbath into Jerusalem. And then a few verses after this one, God actually threatens to light the gate on fire if God sees it happen once more. There's no record of that happening, but it's there in Jeremiah 17. Then a few years after Jeremiah, we come across the prophet Ezekiel, who is convinced that all of Judah needs to have a massive revival and call back the Sabbath and follow it to a T. And about 100 years after Ezekiel, there is a governor that is installed by the Empire of Persia. His name is Nehemiah. He comes back and he looks around at the people that are in Jerusalem. He says, we've got to reestablish our national identity. We've got to reestablish our religious identity. And so he says, all commerce must stop on Sabbath. He writes about this in chapter 10 of his book, where it says, if on the Sabbath the foreigners bring their grain or merchandise to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or any holy day. And then in the last chapter of Nehemiah, we read about how he actually stands at the city gate and makes sure that no one is selling any goods. Now, after this story, this is the last story in the Hebrew Bible about Sabbath. And it's here that the Bible goes dark, particularly the Christian Bible, because that is like one of the last events that's described in the Hebrew Bible that takes place. Now, there are the stories of Jesus that take place in the New Testament, but there is this period of about 400 years that scholars refer to as the intertestamental period. Let me hear you say intertestamental this morning. It's fun, isn't it? And while there are no writings in some Christian Bibles about what happened in these 400 years, there are other Christian Bibles that have 80 books in the Bible. The 14 books that aren't in the other ones are called the Apocrypha. And these 14 books are actually essential to understand what's going on in Jesus' life, because there's a major event that happens that most Christians that only have 66 books in their Bible are completely unaware of. Now, to tell you about this story, we have to just give you a little bit of context. Around the year 330 BCE, the Greeks showed up, led by Alexander the Great, and conquered the Persians, conquered Judea, and then made Jerusalem part of the Greek Empire. Eventually, the Greeks turned into the Seleucid Empire, and there was a guy named Antiochus who was sent by Greece to Jerusalem to make sure that everyone became Hellenistic. We had to get rid of all the food that wasn't Hellenistic food. We had to get rid of all the ideas that weren't Hellenistic. Greece wanted every person in the Greek Empire to have the same religion, make the same sacrifices. They wanted to get rid of diversity completely. So Antiochus got that job from Greece. And as you can imagine, there were some people who were like, whatever. And there were other people who said, absolutely not. People like a man named Mattathias. Now, Mattathias realized that he couldn't start a rebellion in Jerusalem because it was too much of a focal point for the Greek Empire. So he and his followers and his son went to a nearby city named Modin. And when he got to Modin, if you were to go there to this day, it would look something like this. When he got to Modin, he was chased down eventually by one of Antiochus's officers. We read about it in the book 1 Maccabees that says, the officers of Antiochus Epiphanes in charge of enforcing the apostasy came to the city of Modin to organize the sacrifices. These are Hellenistic sacrifices, not sacrifices that are part of the Jewish religion. We then read, many Israelites supported them, but Mattathias and his family drew apart. Then the officers addressed Mattathias, you are a leader, an honorable and great citizen in the city. Come now, be the first to obey the royal command as all the Gentiles and the leaders of Judah and the survivors of Jerusalem have done. Then you and your family will be numbered among the ruler's friends, and you will be enriched with silver and gold and many gifts. So the officers of Antiochus look at Mattathias like, this guy's a leader. He's going to be a troublemaker. Let's try to buy him off. Let's give him lots of money and give him lots of positions of status and see if he'll comply then with this Hellenistic overhaul. But Mattathias answered resoundingly, although all the Gentiles in the realm of Antiochus may obey him, forsaking the religion of their ancestors and consenting to the royal orders, still I and my family will keep the covenant of our ancestors. God forbid that we should forsake the laws and commandments. We will not obey the words of Antiochus, nor depart from our religion in the slightest degree. And then in the very next verse, there is a Jew who is walking up to offer a pagan sacrifice at a Hellenistic temple, and Mattathias sees it, and he is filled with rage. So much rage that he picks up a knife and stabs the Jew and says, you cannot betray our ancestors. He is then so angry, he turns to the officer, the Greek officer, stabs and murders him as well, and then turns to all the people who are watching him, he just committed 2 murders. He turns to all the people and says, let everyone who is zealous for the law and who stands for the covenant follow after me. And so thousands of people followed Mattathias away from Modin into the hills that were outside of Modin, and they started to hide in caves in thousands of numbers. Now, this is a really important part of the story. It's told in 1 Maccabees. And it's here that the soldiers knew where they went. So the Seleucids sent some soldiers up to the caves to go convert these people into Hellenistic people or to kill them. And so soldiers went in mass to the hills, and they eventually found a cave. Mattathias was not in this cave, but they found a cave filled with people who were seeking refuge there, who wanted to stay true to their cultural heritage. So these Greek soldiers knew exactly what to do. They waited until the Sabbath. And once the Sabbath arrived, they went to the entrance of the cave, and they said to the people inside the cave, enough of this, you rebels. Surrender now and obey this ruler's decrees, and you will live. And the response from the Jews inside the cave was this, no, we will never surrender, nor will we obey the royal command and scorn the Sabbath. So the Seleucid army looked at each other, nodded, and rushed inside the cave. And we read that the soldiers attacked them, but they did nothing, they being the Jews, did nothing to resist. They didn't even throw stones or block the entrances to the caves where they were hiding. And as they were being slaughtered by the Greek army, they were recorded as saying this, let us die innocent. Heaven and earth are our witnesses that you kill us unjustly, because they did not want to break the Sabbath, and they had this sense that you could not defend yourself and keep the Sabbath. Now, you read through these verses, and it gets really heavy. We read the soldiers attacked, and everyone died, women, men, children, and all the livestock. 1,000 died that day. Now, the word got to Mattathias in a different cave. And he was looking there with his closest advisors, And they started to talk about what this meant. They grieved the loss of these 1,000 people who were hiding out in the hills with them. And then he says to his advisors, if we do what our people have done, refusing to fight the Gentiles to save our lives and preserve our law, they will wipe us all off the face of the earth. So, coming to a decision, they let it be known to those that were with them that we will resist anyone who attacks us on the Sabbath. We will not die as our people have died in their caves. Now, this whole phrase that starts this verse, coming to a decision, is an important phrase. Because you think about all the 1,200 years of practicing Sabbath that came before this, and how their ancestors debated as to whether or not you could defend yourself on the Sabbath and still keep it. And the overall consensus was you probably shouldn't fight back if somebody fights you. After keeping the Sabbath for 1,200 years, Mattathias adjusted the Sabbath and his faith to meet the needs of his day. And you can disagree with what Mattathias did there, or you can agree and say that was the right thing to do. That doesn't really matter. What we can all acknowledge, though, is that they had to make an adjustment in order to meet the needs of their day. And that changed the way they kept Sabbath going forward. And when we think about faith and the history of faith, I think that these adjustments make up the history of theology. We're all in generations making adjustments, trying to understand who God is in our day and age. And we often view these adjustments as betrayals to the faith. But so often you can find stories in the scripture as well as stories in the Apocrypha that talk about how people had to adjust their faith, and all of a sudden adjusting faith is actually very traditional. And so this happened around, the year 200 BCE. And while Mattathias and his fellow countrymen were wiped out that day, he lived on and he continued to raise an army, and this is known as the Maccabean Revolt. And there were some other factors at play, but the Maccabees, they won. They actually drove the Greeks out in the year 140 BCE, and all of a sudden Jerusalem and Judea was a free nation for the first time in several centuries. This lasted all the way for about 100 years until the Romans showed up from the north and once again captured Jerusalem, and Jerusalem became a city under Roman Empire rule. Now, about 90 years after the Romans showed up, some stories started to unfold in an unknown village known as Capernaum. And it was here that a man named Jesus from Nazareth set up his shop, started to live here in this fishing village, and he started to teach things about how the kingdom of God was close. And there's this story at the beginning of Mark that unfolds at the synagogue on a Sabbath day. And it's here that Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, and people are amazed by his teaching. They can't believe what he's teaching. It's relevant, it's fresh, it's cutting edge, it's blowing their minds, right? And then all of a sudden, a man walks in who makes a large disturbance, and the way Mark tells it is Mark talks about how this man is possessed by a demon. Now, if you are new to church, you may hear a demon possession, you may think to yourself, I'm out. Let's talk for a second about demon possession because it's important to acknowledge, particularly when reading the Gospel of Mark. People have asked me before, do you believe in demon possession? My answer is very clear, no. You may ask me how I can say that so confidently, and the reason why is because I have lived in the shadow of Loma Linda University Medical Center for a very long time now, and this institution has a history that goes back over 100 years, right? And in the last 100 years, this faith-based hospital, how many times do you think they've diagnosed a patient with a demon possession? 0. 100 years, 0 demon possessions. This is a large enough sample size to draw a conclusion, my friends. And so when we have modern medicine, it changes the way we think about it. And modern medicine is able to dispel the idea that people can be possessed by demons. And while modern healthcare has dispelled this idea of demon possessions, it's important that when we read the text to recognize something, we must remember that demon possession was a perceived reality for ancient people. Like Mark didn't have any kind of scientific method to figure out what this person's diagnosis was, right? There wasn't any way for him to go through some kind of health book or health manual and be able to say, oh yeah, that's what he's suffering from, this is the treatment. No, for him, for Mark, it really felt like a demon had possessed this person because that's the common vernacular that people use to describe suffering they couldn't explain, right? And so this man comes in that's possessed by a demon in the story, and I try to empathize with Mark as he sees all of this. And as this man is going through this disease, Jesus cures him in front of everybody, and everyone is amazed by this curing, by this healing. And as soon as this person is cured, everybody can't wait for their time in the synagogue to be done, because they immediately go out and start telling everyone they know about what they saw on the Sabbath in synagogue. Now, Jesus and his disciples also leave the synagogue. In the next story, they go to Simon's mother-in-law's house, and she's there, she's in bed, she has a fever. Jesus goes over to her on the Sabbath, and he goes and takes her by the hand, helps her up, and the fever left her. Now, a Jewish audience would hear this at this point in this day and age, and they would say, oh, that fever is not a life-threatening illness. That was not supposed to happen. But there's only two people who see this, so it's not very controversial. And then as the story unfolds, it gets closer to later in the evening, and as the sunset is going down, we read, after sunset, as evening drew on, they brought to Jesus all who were ill and possessed by demons. Jesus healed many who were sick with different diseases and cast out many demons. Well, there's two words that we have to focus on here, and those two words are after sunset. Why was it after sunset? Because everyone assumed that if you're sick or you have a demon possession, you couldn't get healed on the Sabbath. And so they all had this rule that kept them from going and experiencing healing for themselves. Now, Christians should pay attention to this. And I want to say this to anyone here who identifies as a Christian, to my Christian siblings, this story should tell us something and ask a question that we should regularly ask ourselves. To my Christian siblings, how has your religion kept you from Jesus? How have the rules that you've made kept you from the life of Jesus Christ? I think particularly in the way that the Christian community has treated LGBT individuals, that this story needs to be read over and over again. Because we have for too long denied the image of Christ in our queer siblings, as opposed to us saying, like, God is a universal God, God is God of all, and acknowledging the image of Christ in all. Now, there are some people here who don't identify as Christian, no problem at all. To you, who I would call my progressive siblings, this story can also help you. I think a question that we should ask is, how have your ideals made healing more difficult? Like when you know that someone is wrong because they've committed some crime or they've done something that's immoral, right? Have you been able to say, oh, I was right, they were wrong? I've got the truth, they don't, and then just kind of write them off? Because I actually think that that prevents you from where God is leading you, because God always leads toward restoration and forgiveness, even if the person who wronged you doesn't ask for forgiveness. And so this story about sundowns and healing serves as a warning to all of us to hold up the mirror and ask ourselves, what is it that I hold valuable that has prevented me from helping to heal another human being or even heal myself? Now, a few verses later, we come across a story that Elin, Noel, and Maya read just a few moments ago. It takes place in a grain field. It's, of course, on the Sabbath. And on the Sabbath, Jesus and his disciples are walking through the grain field. And there's some religious leaders who are there just waiting for them to mess up, and wouldn't you know it, they see them. They see them mess up. The disciples reach across, grab some grain, and start to eat it. Immediately, the religious leaders say, look, why are your disciples doing something on the Sabbath day that is forbidden? And Jesus tells them a story about David, and then he says this, the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. And if you look at this story, this is not urgent. Them snacking is not an urgent story, right? Nobody's dying if they have this snack or if they don't, right? And yet, this story shows us something about how small something can be in order to overrule something as important as the Sabbath. In fact, this story is about hunger. And if we look clearly at what this story means for us today, I think that Jesus is telling us that hunger is more important than even the most sacred religious rule there is. Because where does your value come from? Is it from your religion? No. It's from your humanity. And hunger is a symptom of humanity. And I believe that humanity is more important than even the most sacred religious rule. Religion is made for people, not people for religion, right? And this is what Jesus is getting at in that grain field thousands of years ago. Now, shortly after that, we're going to tell one more story here. Jesus returns to Capernaum. He goes back to the synagogue, once again on Sabbath. And he is there teaching, and a man with a withered hand walks into the synagogue, and there are religious leaders who follow him because they want to try to trap Jesus into doing something that's bad, right? And as Jesus sees this man walk in with a withered hand, which, remember, a withered hand, not an emergency, right? He sees him, and he calls the man up front so that everybody can see. And before he says anything to the man with the withered hand, he turns to the religious leaders, and he asks them a couple questions. Is it permitted to do a good deed on the Sabbath or an evil one? To preserve life or to destroy it? And I have no doubt in my mind that Jesus and all the religious leaders know their history well enough to know that he is talking specifically about Mattathias. Is it okay to bend the rules to defend oneself? Or what about to preserve life with healing? And Jesus asked them this question point blank, and if they say, oh yeah, you can't bend the Sabbath for anything, he would call on Mattathias. But if they say, oh, it's okay to only bend the Sabbath for war, Jesus would say, I think there's something better. So the response they have is quite simply, silence. They decide to not answer. And so Jesus looks at them, and he is filled with anger toward them. Not because they tried, but because they refused to try, right? And we read, Jesus was filled with anger. He looked at them with anger, for he was deeply grieved that they had closed their hearts so, that they had been so willing to accept bending the rules for war, but not for the healing of another. So Jesus said to the man, stretch out your hand, and the man was healed. Immediately, the religious leaders exit. They cannot wait to start plotting against Jesus, and that's the next verse that happens, but we need to go back for just a moment and go to that teaching with Mattathias and the context in full view. I think the lesson for us today from this story is that we must never be willing to make exceptions for war that we are unwilling to make for healing. We must never be willing to make exceptions for war that we are unwilling to make for healing. I am not the first person who has picked up on this. In fact, back in 1967, somebody came up with the idea that was very similar to this because he said he was a follower of Jesus. And his story unfolds in New York City at the famed Riverside Church, when in the second to last year of his life, Martin Luther King was invited to talk about Vietnam, and he opened a can of worms and then some as he talked about America's conscience and where America was going with this war. It is considered to be his most controversial speech in his entire life because he talked about how America was partly to blame for the way the Vietnam War had unfolded, and then he talked about how we need to empathize with the Viet Cong, as well as how we need to empathize with the poor soldiers that are American that don't really have a choice in the matter. And he talked about the problems with militarism and materiality and racism, and one of the main points he made was this: a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. My friends, I think that this quote should stay with you all weekend as we remember the life of the extraordinary Martin Luther King Jr. My friends, may we cease to make exceptions for war that we are unwilling to make for healing. Amen.